The legal battle between the Justice Department and former President Trump heads into a Florida courtroom today. A judge will decide whether to grant former President Trump's request for a special master to review documents seized from Mar-a-Lago. Wake Up Charlotte's Bree Jackson is in D.C. with the latest.
Sarah, the Trump legal team doubled down on its request for a special master and downplayed the Justice Department's concerns about the classified documents found at Mar-a-Lago, saying there was no cause for alarm. The public legal battle over the FBI's search of former President Trump's Florida home heads into the courtroom this afternoon. Trump's team arguing that left to their own devices, unchecked investigators would selectively leak bits of their investigation. This in response to the Justice Department's bombshell filing, including information on top-secret documents, as well as other classified evidence seized and displayed in this photo.
So that the public believes that this is top-secret documents that were on his floor. It's ridiculous.
Trump's lawyers insist the need for a special master remains in place, renewing their push for an independent assessment of attorney-client privilege documents and what falls under executive privilege.
So it's a little odd to be seeking a special master when you can't identify.
Okay, we need to talk about what just happened at the Supreme Court because this is absolutely insane, and I'm not using that word lightly. The Supreme Court just handed down a ruling that has legal experts, constitutional scholars, and basically everyone who understands how American government works completely freaking out. We're talking about a decision that fundamentally changes the balance of power in this country, a ruling that strips away some of the judiciary's most important tools for checking executive power, and yet it directly benefits President Trump in a massive way. The Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision, just made it significantly harder for lower courts to block Trump's most controversial executive orders. We're talking about things like his attempt to end birthright citizenship, his expansion of emergency powers, his most aggressive immigration policies, stuff that multiple federal judges have already ruled unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court just said, yeah, those lower court rulings don't matter as much anymore. Some of Trump's orders can go into effect anyway, even if courts think they're unconstitutional. Let that sink in for a second. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Any of the documents that you say are privileged.
Trump family members believe the federal government's investigation is political.
My father-in-law has said he has nothing to hide. He did nothing wrong.
The Justice Department's filing suggests the former president could face legal trouble. The DOJ laying out evidence that government records were likely concealed and removed, and that efforts were taken to obstruct the investigation. But no word on charges yet.
What we need to do is let the FBI and federal prosecutors do their work, gather the facts, and make their best judgment.
Later today, a federal judge will determine whether a neutral third party will review the documents found.
This is being called a constitutional crisis, not by partisan hacks or political commentators trying to generate clicks, by actual constitutional law professors, by legal analysts who've spent their entire careers studying separation of powers and checks and balances. They're using phrases like unprecedented, dangerous, and a fundamental reshaping of American democracy. Because what the Supreme Court just did is essentially tell lower federal judges that their power to restrain the executive branch has been dramatically reduced. That even when they find a presidential action unconstitutional, that finding might not matter. The order can still take effect in certain areas while appeals play out. And given how long appeals take, that means Trump can implement policies that courts have declared illegal and keep them in place for months or even years before the Supreme Court finally weighs in. By which point, the damage is already done. The ruling came down on June 28, 2025. And the reaction has been swift and intense. Legal experts at the New York Times are calling this another instance of diminishing checks on executive power as President Trump consolidates authority. Think about that phrasing. Consolidates authority. That's not normal democratic governance. That's what happens in countries where power is concentrating in the hands of one branch, one office, one person. And it's happening here, right now, with the Supreme Court's blessing. The specific case that triggered this ruling involved Trump's executive order on birthright citizenship. You know, the 14th Amendment provision that says anyone born on U.S. soil is automatically a citizen. Trump issued an executive order trying to end that for children of undocumented immigrants. Every single lower court that looked at it said, nope, that's clearly unconstitutional. You can't just executive order away a constitutional amendment. But the Supreme Court just said those lower courts don't have the final say anymore. The order can proceed in certain jurisdictions while the legal fight continues. Can you believe this? We're talking about one of the most fundamental rights in American law, enshrined in the Constitution itself, and the Supreme Court is allowing the president to effectively suspend it through executive action, even though lower courts have ruled it unconstitutional. Even though legal scholars from across the political spectrum agree it violates the plain text of the 14th Amendment, none of that matters now because the Supreme Court has decided that preventing immediate harm from unconstitutional executive actions is less important than preserving executive authority. And this isn't just about birthright citizenship. This ruling sets a precedent that applies to basically any executive order Trump wants to issue: immigration policy, emergency declarations, federal funding decisions, regulatory changes, all of it. If Trump issues an order and a lower court blocks it, the Supreme Court has now made it much easier for that order to take effect anyway, while appeals grind through the system. This is a fundamental shift in how our government works. For over 2 centuries, federal courts have had the power to issue injunctions, temporary restraining orders that stop government actions while their constitutionality is being determined. It's one of the most important checks on executive power because without it, a president could do basically anything, implement any policy, no matter how illegal, and just say, well, take me to court and we'll see what happens in a few years. By which time, again, the damage is done. The Supreme Court just weakened that check dramatically. They didn't eliminate it entirely, but they made it much harder for lower courts to actually stop executive actions in real time. And legal analysts are warning that this could set a precedent for a future where presidential orders face almost no meaningful judicial review, where the president can act first and worry about legality later, knowing that courts have limited power to actually stop anything. This is separation of powers collapsing. This is checks and balances being dismantled. And it's happening with the approval of the highest court in the land. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, in her dissent, didn't mince words. She wrote that the president is now a king above the law. And she said, I fear for our democracy. That's a Supreme Court justice, someone with decades of legal experience, saying she fears for American democracy because of a ruling her own court just issued. When was the last time you heard that kind of language from the Supreme Court? This isn't normal judicial disagreement. This is a warning, a cry for help, an acknowledgement that something fundamental has broken. And we need to understand what just happened here and what it means for the future, because this goes way beyond Trump. This is about whether we still have a functioning system of checks and balances, or whether we've entered a new era of near unchecked presidential power. So let's break down exactly what this ruling does and why it's triggering a full-blown constitutional crisis. All right, so to understand why this Supreme Court ruling is such a massive deal, we need to talk about how judicial review of executive actions is supposed to work. Because for most of American history, the system has been pretty straightforward. President issues an executive order or takes some action. Someone challenges it in court, arguing it's illegal or unconstitutional. A federal judge looks at the evidence, examines the law, and decides whether the action can proceed. If the judge thinks the action is likely unconstitutional or illegal, they issue an injunction. That's a court order that says, stop, you can't do this while we figure out if it's legal. The injunction stays in place while the case works its way through appeals. Could take months or years, but during that time, the potentially illegal action is blocked. The government can't implement it, can't enforce it. It's frozen until courts reach a final decision on its legality. This system exists for a very good reason, because without it, the president could implement any policy, no matter how unconstitutional, and the harm would be done before courts could stop it. Imagine if Trump issued an executive order tomorrow saying, I don't know, all mosques are hereby closed, or all guns are hereby confiscated, or all Democrats are banned from voting. Obviously unconstitutional, right? Well, without the power of injunctions, courts couldn't stop those orders from being implemented while legal challenges played out. The mosques would be closed, the guns would be taken, the voters would be turned away, and maybe 3 years later, the Supreme Court would finally rule that it was unconstitutional all along. But by then, the damage would be irreversible. That's why injunctions exist. They're a critical check on executive power. They allow courts to prevent immediate harm while determining legality. And for over 200 years, this system has worked reasonably well. Sure, presidents have pushed boundaries. They've tried to expand their authority, but courts have generally been able to step in and say, hold on, let's make sure this is legal first. The Supreme Court just fundamentally changed that system. In their ruling, they established new standards for when lower courts can issue injunctions against executive actions. And those new standards make it much harder for courts to actually stop presidential orders. The majority opinion, written by conservative justices and joined by the court's 6-member conservative majority, argues that lower courts have been too quick to issue nationwide injunctions against executive actions, that a single district court judge shouldn't be able to freeze a presidential order for the entire country. And okay, there's actually been legitimate debate about nationwide injunctions. Some legal scholars think they're overused, That maybe a district court should only be able to block an order in their specific jurisdiction, not everywhere. Fine, that's a reasonable position, but the Supreme Court went way beyond that. They didn't just limit nationwide injunctions, they created a new framework that makes it harder to get any injunction against executive actions, even ones that seem clearly unconstitutional. The new standard, as laid out in the ruling, requires lower courts to give extraordinary deference to presidential judgments about national security, immigration, and executive authority. Courts now have to essentially assume the president is acting lawfully unless there's overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And even when there is such evidence, courts have to consider whether blocking the action would harm executive branch interests or national security. In practice, what this means is that Trump can issue an executive order, claim it's related to national security or immigration or executive authority, and courts will have a very hard time stopping it, even if the order appears to violate the Constitution, even if it contradicts clear statutory law. The Supreme Court has told lower courts to defer, to trust, to give the president the benefit of the doubt, and that's a massive shift from how things used to work. Let's apply this to the birthright citizenship order, since that's the case that prompted this ruling. Trump issued an executive order saying that children born in the United States to undocumented immigrants are no longer automatically citizens. This directly contradicts the 14th Amendment, which states very clearly that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens. That language is unambiguous. It doesn't say citizens can choose to exclude certain babies. It says all persons born here are citizens, period. Multiple federal district courts looked at Trump's order and said, yeah, this is blatantly unconstitutional. We're blocking it immediately. Those judges issued injunctions preventing the order from taking effect. Under the old system, those injunctions would stay in place until the Supreme Court finally ruled on the merits, which could take years. But under the new framework the Supreme Court just established, those lower court injunctions don't have the same force. The Supreme Court essentially said, even though these lower courts think the order is unconstitutional, executive authority over immigration policy is so important that we need to let some of this order take effect while appeals proceed. So now, in certain jurisdictions, Trump's birthright citizenship order is being implemented. Children are being denied citizenship based on their parents' immigration status, all while the legal fight continues. And maybe eventually the Supreme Court will rule on the merits and declare the whole thing unconstitutional, but that could be years from now. And in the meantime, how many children will be denied citizenship? How many families will be torn apart? How many lives will be disrupted? The harm is happening right now, in real time, because the Supreme Court decided that preserving executive authority is more important than preventing unconstitutional actions from taking effect. And here's what's truly scary about this. The birthright citizenship order is just the beginning. Trump has dozens of controversial executive actions in the pipeline. Plans to expand emergency powers, efforts to redirect federal funding without congressional approval, immigration crackdowns that civil rights groups say violate due process, environmental deregulation that critics argue violates statutory requirements. All of this stuff would normally face immediate court challenges and likely be blocked by injunctions while its legality is determined. But now Trump knows that even if lower courts block his orders, he has a Supreme Court that's willing to let those orders proceed anyway, that's willing to prioritize executive authority over constitutional constraints. So he's going to keep pushing, keep issuing aggressive orders, keep testing the limits, because the Supreme Court just showed him that even when he crosses constitutional lines, the orders can still take effect. This is what legal experts mean when they talk about a constitutional crisis, not because of any single order or policy, but because the system that's supposed to check executive power has been fundamentally weakened. Justice Sotomayor, in her dissent, captured this perfectly. She wrote that the majority opinion effectively makes the president a king above the law, that by preventing courts from stopping unconstitutional actions before they cause harm, the Supreme Court has created a system where the president can act with impunity, where legal constraints become suggestions rather than requirements, where the Constitution becomes advisory rather than binding. Her dissent ends with one of the most chilling lines ever written by a Supreme Court justice. I fear for our democracy. Not I disagree with this ruling. Not I think the majority got the law wrong, but I fear for our democracy. That's existential language. That's a justice saying she thinks this ruling threatens the fundamental structure of American government, and she's not alone in that assessment. Legal scholars from across the political spectrum, people who normally disagree about everything, are united in their alarm over this ruling. Conservative legal experts, who generally support broad executive authority, are saying this goes too far. Liberal scholars are calling it a catastrophe. Everyone who understands how separation of powers is supposed to work recognizes that something fundamental has changed. The Supreme Court has tilted the balance of power dramatically toward the executive branch. They've made it much harder for courts to serve as a meaningful check on presidential actions, and they've done it at a moment when we have a president who's repeatedly shown a willingness to push constitutional boundaries and test legal limits. The timing couldn't be worse, or from Trump's perspective, couldn't be better, because he now has a Supreme Court that's given him a green light to implement controversial policies first and worry about legality later, that's told him lower court rulings don't really matter as long as he can get cases to the Supreme Court eventually, that's demonstrated a willingness to prioritize executive authority even when constitutional rights hang in the balance. This is the constitutional crisis, not a disagreement about a single policy, not a partisan fight over immigration or citizenship, but a fundamental breakdown in the system of checks and balances that's supposed to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful. The Supreme Court, which is supposed to be the ultimate guardian of constitutional rights and limits on government power, has instead become an enabler of executive overreach. And that should terrify everyone, regardless of their politics. Because this isn't about Trump specifically. It's about what kind of system we have, whether we're a nation of laws that constrain even presidents, or whether we've entered a new era where presidential power faces few meaningful limits. Okay, let's break this down into what actually matters here. Because yeah, this is complex constitutional law stuff, but at its core, there are really just a few key points everyone needs to understand. Point 1. The Supreme Court just made it much harder for federal judges to block presidential actions, even when those actions appear to be unconstitutional. This is a massive shift. For over 2 centuries, courts have had the power to issue injunctions that immediately stop government actions while their legality is being determined. It's been one of the most important checks on executive power. A president can't just do whatever they want and say, "Sue me if you don't like it," because courts could stop the action right away. But the Supreme Court just weakened that power significantly. They created new standards that make it much harder to get injunctions against executive actions. Courts now have to give extreme deference to presidential judgments, especially on national security and immigration issues. They have to assume the president is acting lawfully unless there's overwhelming evidence otherwise, and even when there is such evidence, they have to weigh whether blocking the action would harm executive branch interests. What this means in practice is that Trump and future presidents can now implement controversial policies first and litigate later. The harm happens immediately. The legal fight takes years, and by the time courts finally rule, the damage is done. Point 2. This ruling directly enables Trump's most controversial executive orders to take effect, including his attempt to end birthright citizenship. Multiple lower courts have already ruled that Trump's birthright citizenship order is unconstitutional. The 14th Amendment is crystal clear. All persons born in the United States are citizens. There's no exception for children of undocumented immigrants. The text doesn't leave room for interpretation, but the Supreme Court has essentially said, even though lower courts think this is unconstitutional, we're going to let it proceed in certain areas while appeals play out. So right now, today, children are being denied citizenship based on their parents' immigration status, in direct violation of what multiple federal judges have said the Constitution requires. And this won't be resolved for years. Maybe not until these children are teenagers or adults. That's the harm we're talking about. Not theoretical, not abstract. Real children being denied constitutional rights because the Supreme Court prioritized executive authority over constitutional protections. And it's not just birthright citizenship. This framework applies to any executive order Trump wants to issue, immigration crackdowns, emergency powers, federal funding redirections, environmental deregulation, all of it. If a lower court blocks it, Trump now knows he has a path to implementation anyway. The Supreme Court has his back. Point 3. Justice Sotomayor's dissent is absolutely devastating and should be required reading for every American. Sotomayor didn't just disagree with the majority opinion. She sounded the alarm about what this ruling means for American democracy. She wrote that the president is now effectively a king above the law, that the system of checks and balances has been fundamentally compromised. And she ended with the line, "I fear for our democracy." Those 5 words should shake everyone, because Sotomayor isn't some political activist or partisan commentator. She's a Supreme Court justice with decades of experience in constitutional law. She's seen thousands of cases. She understands how the system works better than almost anyone alive. And she's saying she fears for the survival of American democracy because of this ruling. When was the last time a sitting Supreme Court justice expressed that kind of existential concern? When have we heard language like that from someone on the court itself? This isn't normal judicial disagreement. This is a warning that something fundamental has broken, that the guardrails are failing, that we're entering dangerous territory, and we should listen. Because Sotomayor, whatever you think of her judicial philosophy, understands what's at stake here better than most people. Point 4. This creates a precedent that will outlast Trump and affect every future presidency? This is so important. Even if you support Trump, even if you think his policies are great, even if you believe he's doing the right thing, you should still be concerned about this ruling, because it doesn't just apply to Trump. It establishes a framework that will be used by every future president, Democrat and Republican. Imagine the next Democratic president using these expanded powers, issuing executive orders on gun control, or climate change, or healthcare, and having courts largely unable to stop them, even if they appear unconstitutional. Would Trump supporters be okay with that? Or imagine a future Republican president, even more aggressive than Trump, pushing even further, testing even more limits. Would anyone be comfortable with that president having this level of unchecked authority? The point is, when you weaken checks on executive power, you don't just empower the current president, you empower all future presidents. You create a system where whoever controls the White House has dramatically expanded authority with limited judicial oversight. And that should concern everyone, because you might trust the current president, but do you trust all future presidents? Do you trust the system to always produce leaders who won't abuse expanded powers? Point 5. This is happening at the worst possible time. We're living through a period of intense polarization, deep distrust in institutions, threats to democratic norms, and now the Supreme Court has decided to weaken one of the most important checks on executive power. The timing is almost perfectly wrong, because if there was ever a moment when we needed strong guardrails on presidential authority, it's now. When we needed courts to be able to step in and say, hold on, let's make sure this is legal before we implement it, it's now. Instead, we've got a Supreme Court that's making it easier for presidents to act unilaterally and harder for courts to restrain them. The ripple effects of this ruling are going to be felt for decades. We're probably looking at a significant expansion of executive power across multiple policy areas, less effective judicial oversight, more aggressive use of executive orders, and less accountability when those orders violate constitutional or statutory limits. That's not a functioning democracy. That's something else, something where power concentrates in one office, one branch, one person, and the other branches struggle to provide meaningful checks. So where does this leave us? Well, in a constitutional crisis, honestly, the Supreme Court has fundamentally altered the balance of power in American government. They've made the executive branch stronger and the judicial branch weaker. They've created a system where presidential actions can proceed even when courts think they're unconstitutional. And they've done all of this at a moment when executive power was already expanding and democratic norms were already under strain. This is bad, really bad. Regardless of your politics, regardless of whether you support Trump's policies, because this isn't about any single policy or any single president. This is about the structure of government, about whether we have effective checks and balances, about whether the Constitution actually constrains presidential power or just suggests guidelines that presidents can largely ignore. The Supreme Court just moved us significantly toward the latter, and that should alarm everyone. Because once you lose checks on power, they're very hard to get back. Once you establish precedents for unchecked executive authority, those precedents tend to expand rather than contract. Future presidents will use this ruling to justify even more aggressive actions. They'll push even further, test even more limits, and courts will have less and less power to stop them. That's the trajectory we're on now. Thanks to this Supreme Court ruling, thanks to 6 justices who decided that executive authority is more important than constitutional constraints, Justice Sotomayor was right to fear for our democracy, because we're watching it weaken in real time. We're watching the system of checks and balances that's protected American democracy for over 2 centuries get dismantled piece by piece, and the Supreme Court, which should be the last line of defense for constitutional rights and limits on government power, is instead leading the charge to expand executive authority and reduce judicial oversight. Can you believe this is where we are? That the Supreme Court is the institution weakening checks on presidential power? That's not how it's supposed to work. They're supposed to be the guardians, the protectors, the ones who say no matter how popular a president is, no matter what emergency they claim, the Constitution still applies and we're going to enforce it. Instead, they're saying, actually, let's give presidents more power and make it harder to stop them when they overstep. That's a betrayal of their institutional role, a failure to protect the constitutional order they're sworn to uphold, and we're all going to live with the consequences for decades, because this ruling isn't going away. It's precedent now. It's the law of the land. Every future president will use it. Every future administration will cite it, and the system of checks and balances will continue to erode unless something changes, unless Congress acts, unless future Supreme Courts revisit this decision, unless the American people demand better. But right now, today, we're in a constitutional crisis. The Supreme Court has weakened judicial oversight of executive power, at precisely the moment we need it most. They've enabled a president who's already shown a willingness to push boundaries to push even further, and they've set a precedent that will haunt American democracy for generations. That's the reality we're facing. That's the constitutional crisis we're in, and it's only going to get worse from here.